Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our screencast for today is going to focus on really our presidents of the late 60s and early 70s. And so primarily that's going to focus on President Richard Nixon. So Nixon inherits the Vietnam War, and he inherits some of the domestic troubles of the Vietnam War. And so he has to kind of guide American foreign policy in a little bit of a different direction. So that's what we're going to focus on today, Nixon and Nixon's foreign policy. And in class on Monday, we're going to take a look at the domestic policies of Nixon and also his, the person who follows him, which is Jimmy Carter. So we're going to start with Nixon, what defines Nixon's presidency and his philosophy towards other nations, which is known as the Nixon Doctrine. So remember what I told you guys. Each president, they basically say, starting with Truman, after the Truman Doctrine, they kind of lay out their policy and, they call it, they take the president's last name and put doctrine at the end of it. And this kind of just like is their overarching belief about, how to deal with foreign nations and foreign countries. Now, Nixon, he's a very practical pragmatist as far as the foreign policy is concerned. He doesn't really believe in, these big moral crusades and these necessarily ideological battles around the world. So he's going to take our foreign policy in a slightly different direction. He does believe in combating communism, but he thinks it's much better to combat it using money, and it's much better to combat it using providing weapons and machines for other countries than he thinks it would be to actually send troops on the ground. So you see a good example of this is you see what Richard Nixon does in Vietnam. The policy of Richard Nixon in Vietnam, he calls it Vietnamization, which means that slowly we turn the war over from having American troops fighting the war to Vietnamese troops fighting the war. And America is going to help fund it. They're going to send weapons, they're going to send money, but it's not going to be American troops on the ground fighting. So that's a perfect example of Nixon's philosophy and the Nixon Doctrine. So you want to remember that, Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. Now, beyond that, another idea of Nixon's is that there are no real ultimate enemies and ultimate friends. Nixon and his Secretary of State named Henry Kissinger, they basically believe in something known as Realpolitik, which you may have learned about in global history. And this is kind of if you translate it literally, it's the politics of reality, meaning there are no ultimate friends and ultimate enemies in the world. You can use nations to your best, to your advantage. So they're basically, their philosophy is use foreign nations to the advantage of the United States. You can be friends with a nation at one time and not friends with them at another time. So there are no ultimate friends and enemies, which is a very different philosophy, I think, than, kind of the true policy of containment, which is any communist country, you view them as a potentially negative force in the world. And this is another good example that goes along with the Nixon Doctrine that kind of shows how they take this era in a little bit different direction. And we start talking to people that you would never expect us to talk to. Okay? So if you look here, he's basically going to try and enter an era of negotiation. He believes that he can talk to these nations. So the first country he's going to reach out to is China. So think about it. China is one of the biggest communist nations in the world. And Nixon is willing to open up a dialogue with them. So this is new. This is a change. When you look at, compared to his predecessors, he's going to try and open up a dialogue with them. Now, as many of you know, in a lot of ways, there's two Chinas. You have mainland China and you have Taiwan. And they had fought a civil war. And so we had a relationship with the Taiwanese because they had a democratic form of government, but we had not had a relationship with mainland China at all. But Nixon is going to try and open up a conversation. So this is known as rapprochement, which is kind of like the opening of a dialogue, the opening of a relationship with the Chinese. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this in the movie Forrest Gump. We sent a ping pong team to China to kind of open up some avenue of diplomacy and some avenue of conversation. But Nixon, he visits China himself, and he's trying to open up and have a relationship with the Chinese. Now, why? Think back in American history, right? think back to the Opendoor Policy. I think Nixon sees opportunities, not just diplomatically, but economically with China. It's been 100 years, and we've been trying to open up China to trade. And so that maybe is one key aspect to what Nixon is trying to do, and he's pretty successful with that. If you look now, China is basically our biggest trading partner in the world. And so you can thank Nixon and Nixon opening up this dialogue to China kind of being opened up as a trading partner. It also has a lot to do with their next leader, a guy named Deng Xiaoping, who comes to power and then kind of facilitates a more, I want to call it capitalism, but a more open form of communism. Now, the other thing here you kind of see in the quotes. So let's read this quote. The growing dissonance between the USSR and China has limited both countries in the pursuit of policies basically antagonistic to U.S. interests. You may also remember this from global history. The Chinese and the Soviet Union, they're both communist. So when originally the Chinese became communist in 1949, obviously the Soviet Union had been communist for years at that point. The Chinese kind of followed the Soviets' lead in the world. But increasingly the Chinese and the Soviet Union were competing for kind of like top influential communist power. And Nixon and Kissinger and Nixon's team sensed that. So he's smart, playing the game of Realpolitik, of reality politics, of whatever is best for your nation. He tries to play one communist country off the other. So he opens up a dialogue with the Chinese. And then he's going to try and open up a dialogue with the Soviet Union. And he knows that he can play these countries off of each other, and it's going to be to the benefit of the United States ultimately. So Nixon's a good politician. He's a smart politician. It gets him in a lot of trouble, as we're going to talk about on Monday, but he does have some political acumen going for him. Now think, what would George Washington think of this whole situation? Would he be in favor of it? Would he be against it? I'm not going to tell you guys. Maybe you should pause the video, jot down what you think George Washington would think about rapprochement, about dealing with the Chinese, opening up trade, and then also the diplomatic relationships with the Chinese. All right, the Soviet Union. So again, with the Soviet Union, Nixon is going to take a little bit of a different approach. He's going to be open to discussing things with the Soviet Union and to have more of a conversation with them. He doesn't necessarily view them as the ultimate enemy. He views the Soviet Union as pursuing interests, their own interests, in favor of their benefit, their country, and he views the United States basically as trying to do the same thing. So he feels like he can work with them. And again, he also wants to open up a diplomatic dialogue because he knows he could use that leverage against the Chinese. So it's using one country's leverage against another country's leverage. So Nixon is going to start a policy known as détente. Okay? And détente is kind of like an easing of the tension with the Soviet Union. So they're going to start negotiating, talking to one another. They're going to start trying to put limits on how many new nuclear weapons they produce and arms in general. So this is meant to kind of like ease the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And they signed some agreements. So this is the first one they signed, SALT I, which really kind of, again, it's abbreviated, SALT is abbreviation for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, and it's successful. They signed this agreement and they agree to limit how many weapons they're going to produce, and they follow through with this stuff. So they're taking a lead here in easing tension during the Cold War. So remember when I told you there's ebbs and there's flows in the Cold War? There's times where it gets really, really tense and times where it kind of eases. Nixon's administration, to a large extent, is an easing in tension because he opens up negotiations, he opens up communications, they're reducing arms. Unlike the Eisenhower administration where they're building up arms, they're building, he's reducing kind of how much they're producing during the time period. And SALT I is a good example of that. It's just a picture of them when they signed the treaty. And he also goes to the Soviet Union. So he's the first person. He goes and he visits Brezhnev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union. And that hadn't happened in generations, that they, an American leader had gone there. And so, again, major changes, different approach to the Cold War. Now, it's not that he doesn't believe in containment. He definitely believes in containment, Nixon. He just doesn't want to do it in the same way that his predecessors did it. And so he's kind of scaling it back and taking a totally different approach to it. And a lot of this is known as triangular diplomacy, where they try to play the Chinese off the Russians. And Kissinger is kind of the mastermind behind a lot of this stuff. And, he's got Nixon's ear and kind of being able to play the game of world diplomacy. They look at it as not a battle of moral rights and wrongs and democracy's right and wrong. They look at it as kind of a game of self-interest, and every country's out for their own self-interest, and the United States has to kind of use other nations' self-interest to their advantage. Okay, guys, so we're going to stop there. We're not really going to go into the Middle Eastern diplomacy too much. We'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. One thing you want to know is that the United States increasingly gets involved in the Middle East, okay? So traditionally, we're not really going to get too involved in it. But increasingly in this time period, the United States, it's another form of the Cold War proxy wars. And it's going to center around kind of the Arab-Israeli relations and things that are going on in Israel with different Arab neighbors. So the United States is going to kind of go into another area of the world. And this is, again, an extension of the Cold War, bringing us into other parts of the world and the United States being recognized as a major world power. Okay, guys, I'll see you on Monday. We'll focus on domestic things on Monday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.